Happy New Year, everyone. I'm Michaela Parker, founder and executive director of the Academic Data Science Alliance, and I'm here to welcome you to the monthly Listen and Lunch AI Speaker Series. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Stan Ahalt. He will be telling us about pioneering faculty guidelines for Gen AI at UNC-Chapel Hill. But I want to take a moment to remind everyone that this webinar, along with our events, is guided by our code of conduct. There's a QR code on this slide that can take you to our code to learn more. You can also find it on our homepage. For those of you who are not familiar with the Academic Data Science Alliance, or ADSA, we are a community for data science leaders, practitioners, and educators who believe in a just, equitable future where data science are thoughtfully applied in all domains for the benefit of all. To learn more about our resources and events, you can visit our website. I put the URL on this slide, and there's another QR code that will also take you to our homepage. But I think right now we should get started. This is only a 30-minute webinar, and I am delighted to welcome Dr. Stan Ahalt, who serves as the inaugural Dean of the School of Science and Society at UNC-Chapel Hill. Ahalt was previously the director of the Renaissance Computing Institute, or RENCI, at UNC-Chapel Hill, and he continues to serve at RENCI as the executive advisor and domain scientist for team science. Ahalt has a passion for applying data science through a team science approach to address the most pressing challenges affecting society, including COVID-19, weather and climate, the opioid and pain management crises, treatment discovery, and bias in our court system. So thank you so much, Stan, for joining us.
Very glad to be here.
So let's get started. Given your role as the co-chair of UNC-Chapel Hill's Faculty and Staff Committee, tasked with developing guidelines and resources on the usage of generative AI technologies on your campus, can you start by sharing a few of the initial goals of that generative AI committee?
Sure, I'd be glad to. The generative AI committee was convened by our provost in kind of the late spring of 2023, right at the beginning of summer. And it became very apparent at that time that generative AI was going to impact the way we teach. And so we wanted to make sure that we offered up some faculty guidelines so that they had something to utilize in their classrooms. And when I say guidelines, we decided early on that it wasn't going to be policy, because policy at the university usually means something quite formal, and there's a process that you have to go through. And we didn't think we would have time to both complete our creating some guidelines and getting it turned into policy. And that turned out to be very fortuitous, because I think that in an area that's changing that quickly, it's going to be very hard to do that. So we wanted to make sure that we, gave something to help the faculty, give them some guidance. And early on, we made the decision that we weren't going to collectively, I'll call it, permit the faculty to do what faculty are inclined to do, including myself, which is stick our head in the sand. Instead, we wanted to confront the fact, and I think it was the right call, and we did have some guidance from other universities. I'll just call out and give a shout out to Michigan, because they did a very nice report at about the same time, and they had moved very briskly in this direction. They didn't necessarily have guidelines, but they had a nice report saying, here's how we think it's going to impact things. So we wanted to make sure that faculty were given the flexibility to embrace the challenges that were presented by AI, but also we wanted to make sure that they had the flexibility to make decisions on even individual assignments about whether or not generative AI could be used. But it does, it rapidly became something that was significantly more difficult than we anticipated. For example, I still haven't resolved in my mind if we need to stop teaching programming and instead teach the use of prompting instead of programming. But the question is, can you be a proficient coder but not know the intricacies of the particular language? And I'm not confident that that's a good idea either. We also have an industry working group that has generally agreed that data scientists need to know how to do programming and know how to prompt. So we were getting feedback from lots of different questions. And so one of the things I'd love to see ADSA take up is a key question of how generative AI may dramatically change what we teach. I think that's something that we have had discussions on, and we need to continue to do that. We didn't come to any resolution on this question, but we did work together to develop guidelines for faculty and students and eventually researchers and staff. And a lot of that was done because of the groundswell of people, approaching the committee and saying, we need to be able to help, the community at large, not just the faculty. So we also talked seriously about providing training for faculty and staff, and we were discovering that there were some private companies like Microsoft that could help us with that. And so we had to make a lot of decisions very rapidly, and luckily I think we made reasonable decisions. So that's a long answer to a quick question.
And it prompts so many questions for me that are not even on our little agreed upon. So I'm probably going to follow up with you anyway. Lots
Sure.
to unpack there. Very exciting. But I think just in the interest of time, we'll stick to our pre-scripted questions. Sure. And this one actually does a little bit riff off of what you just mentioned with respect to training faculty and staff. Sorely needed, but it's also something that very clearly suffers from money and bandwidth, right? The two things that we all Absolutely. Have a little of, time and money. So without that kind of bias into your answer, what are some of the key considerations you believe should be included in generative AI guidelines? And if you want to talk about training too for faculty.
Well, I'll be glad to try to touch on all of those. So early on, we kind of adopted an axiom. I think it was created by one of our faculty members here, that AI should help you think and not think for you. And so we kind of kept that as the central point, that we were accepting the fact that it's going to change the way our students are acting in the workplace. And so we better put it into the classroom as quickly as we can. But again, we didn't want to tell the faculty that they had to do it one way or the other. And of course, there's a range of perspectives on whether or not it's useful in a classroom and how you use it. But so we gave them, I think the key consideration is to the faculty a lot of freedom, and also give them some ways that are authorized by the university to be able to say, well, we can use it in our classroom if we choose to do that. And I already mentioned the fact that these are guidelines, not policy. And so the policy would have required a much greater degree of inspection and discussion and oversight that we didn't feel we could provide. Again, because the landscape is changing so rapidly, and I think that's borne out in the subsequent year and a half or so. It's amazing how fast. I tried to read up on some of the latest developments over the break and was challenged to even figure out which one to read about. So a good example of policy, or it isn't policy and guidelines, is whether or not you need to cite the use of AI, and how often do you need to do that. And I think that, generally speaking, particularly in formal scholarship products, you would require you to note the use of AI. But I'm not sure that we have circumstances in the academy that are very preliminary and doing preliminary work. I think it can be very helpful to help you start getting some ideas on paper. And I'm not sure that requires the use of a citation. And I think it's going to vary from field to field. Various professional organizations are still pretty unsettled about this. When I talk to my colleagues out in industry, it is very clear that they are using it very actively, because it's in some cases dictated by leadership that they should do that. So I'm not even sure it's going to be possible to construct real policy. And so I think we need to, the technology is changing, the norms are changing, and so everything is happening so fast. I think that it's going to be very difficult to do much other than trying to give people some rough guidelines so that we don't go off the rails.
Yeah, consideration too, right? Because you can envision there may be areas where a policy would eventually need to be implemented because there is potential for harm, or there's potential for cheating, or whatever, all the negative things that people think of when they think of implementing AI on campus. So having both guidelines and eventually landing on some policy, I imagine, is important. With respect to the guidelines that you have put together and how these have been disseminated to the faculty. Have you received any feedback from faculty? And has that feedback kind of shaped your thoughts and approach going forward?
It has. We received a lot of very positive feedback that I wasn't necessarily expecting. Of course, we received negative feedback as well, which I was expecting. But the fact that we had to bring in, kind of rapidly do a pivot and make guidelines for not only the faculty and the students, but also for researchers and staffs, because each of these groups have a different, slightly different task and a different context. So, having a different book to pull off the shelf to get you started on a particular task, is not going to necessarily help you. If you're a staff member who's going to be using generative AI to help you, for example, write a contract to remodel a particular room in a particular building, that's a very different task than writing a research paper. And it's probably a task that would benefit significantly for using a large language model or a generative AI model very capably. Of course, you have to do things like checking the math and making sure the specifications aren't things that are completely ridiculous from a construction standpoint. But it's not the same thing. It's not the same set of ethical questions that need to be brought to bear if you're using a large language model, for example, to solve a research problem, which people are doing now very productively. And I think we've heard from a lot of colleagues in North Carolina that they have used our guidelines. We put them up in the public space because we thought there might be other people that were challenging. And we've looked at other people's guidelines. So we more or less understand the lay of the land, and we don't think we're too far off. We have made some modifications even recently, that just because of the feedback that we've gotten. So one question I'd like to at least suggest that we think about is, who's in charge of harmonizing all these guidelines? I mean, how is the academy going to go about reaching some more stable position? Is that something that we need to take up with the AAAS, or is that something ADSA takes on? And so, and it's going to vary from disciplinary area to disciplinary area, of course. But, I think that if these professional societies could get together and say, look, this is what's happening out in the workplace, let's try to figure out how that's going to impact the classroom, I think we'd be ahead of the game.
Yeah, no, that's great. Just wanted to get some clarification too, because of what you mentioned. I think that's a really good perspective to talk about. The university ecosystem is not just about the classroom. There's staff, there's building services, there's all kinds of important activities that happen on a campus that could benefit from AI. And it sounds like, because you do mention research, task force, then I assume it sounds like was not just focused on teaching and the student experience, but you also tackled kind of the research ecosystem and using AI in research. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. We started focusing on the teaching and learning aspects of it, but we very quickly had to adapt and bring in more people from across the campus from a lot of different types of work. And so it ended up what we thought was going to be a nimble and small committee. It was a very large committee, but I was very pleased with the results that we worked together very well. We broke into subcommittees to attack certain tasks. We created some training materials that we were able to put up online. I need to probably go back and look at those now. And I think that it's clearly having, it's an evolving issue. And I think it's going to be involved in far more of our teaching and learning tasks than we truly appreciate, but I think it's going to also be involved in administrative tasks, back office stuff. We're seeing those kind of uses really explode. So I think that we're only starting to see the extensive use of generative AI in a productive way that I expected to happen even quicker. But some of the tools are evolving so rapidly, it's been hard. As you said, resources and are the key. And if you look at an organization like the Khan Academy and the model that they've developed with Conmigo, and the challenges that they found in making that work productively for their students, even though they understood the opportunity that was, to provide students with an artificially generated set of tutoring advice. And I think that where they've ultimately landed, they're very comfortable with their students their students are natively comfortable talking to a phone or a computer. And given that reality, we need to adapt accordingly. And how this impacts our learning and shaping of our minds is not obvious to me. But that's one of the things that I'm hoping that we can pull together, people from neuroscience, from psychology, from the learning sciences, human-computer interaction. And those folks need to come together and have some very deliberative processes to understand how this technology is beginning to shape the evolution of our brains. And so we didn't do this at the beginning of the social network flood that's occurred. Mm-hmm. And I think that we are paying the price that we weren't willing to address this and come to grip with some of these very difficult problems at the confluence of the marketplace and societal good. I would even argue that in some sense, the academy has abdicated its responsibility on social networks. And I know that's not true of all faculty by any means, but I think that we haven't spoken with one consistent voice that, we got to put some boundaries on this. It's not just about making money. And I'd like to see the School of Data Science and Society here at UNC be part of that to generate the right scholarly and pedagogical discussions about these issues. So I don't know if that exactly answered the question, but I hope I got in the right direction.
No, absolutely. And I guess I just have one very brief follow-up from that. Either as part of the task force explicitly, or maybe just by word of mouth, speaking of stakeholders and who's involved on, did you solicit the input from students?
We did, but because we were working in the summer, we had a fairly limited pool to draw from. So we probably didn't do as good a job as that we would have liked to. But we did involve the students, and some of them identified as people who were very interested in this topic. So they were very. It was amazing how many different perspectives there were and how we managed to find some ways to harmonize those perspectives. Committees don't always do a great job of this, but in this case, I think it was largely because of the urgency and the fact that people were fairly self-selecting and volunteering to be part of this. And it actually laid a good groundwork across the campus because people got to know one another, and those social connections, so social networks, if you will, mm-hmm. are still in operation because we've had a running committee ever since that first committee. It's changed its focus. There was a sort of generative AI committee that included people from our board of trustees and from industry. And now we have an AI acceleration program that's been sponsored by the provost, and it continues with some of the same people that were on that original committee. So I think that the urgency played well to what we had to get done in this particular case. That's not always the case for higher ed, but in this case, it happened to work pretty well.
And it worked for consensus building. That's great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think you may have already touched on this question, but I'll ask it again anyway, just in case you have more to add. Looking ahead, how do you envision generative AI transforming teaching and learning, and how should guidelines evolve accordingly? It sounds like you have already you already have the structure there to keep working on those guidelines, but can you add some more to that?
Sure. So I think that we're going to have to come to grips with the fact that we're going to need to make sure that we have a fairly, I'll go back to Michigan. One of the reasons Michigan built Maisie is because they wanted to make sure that the students had, an asset that they could utilize in a specific way without necessarily paying $20 a month or more, okay? Mm-hmm. And so I think that as we move into the next phase of extensive use of generative AI, large language models in the classroom, we're going to have to make it so, and this is something that's a work in progress right now for us, is how do we make it so that every class can, if the faculty member is interested in doing this, rapidly roll out a tutor for that particular class, so that people are able to get help with how they do a particular calculus problem at 2 o'clock in the morning, right before the exam the next day. So we're trying to figure out what the right infrastructure is and how that's going to be paid for. So I think that given the fact that the very nature of these machines are evolving very quickly. I think that we don't yet know how to move in a deliberative fashion to a place where we're confident that the end game is going to be something that we understand right now. I think it's just too many things that are going to be changing.
Right, right, absolutely. And given that, what would be some advice you would give to other university leaders or committee chairs who are beginning similar initiatives?
Well, if you're just beginning now, I would say you should probably feel some degree of urgency, and that's probably the reason you're making this change now. Again, I mentioned the University of Michigan a number of times, so I'd go look at that nice report that I think somebody's already put into the chat. We have some of the changed some of the guidance for both faculty and students. The benefits of the new guidance are, according to the program, I would completely agree. We've made it more clear and more structured, so we provide a more step-by-step framework for integrating AI guidance into our courses. We've also tried to make it more flexible and customizable, so that the pieces that we meant to be more like templates that could be pulled out and put into course syllabus are more adaptable to varied assignments, and has teaching goals with specific examples and language available. We've also increased the amount of discussion that we put into the guidance about ethical and responsible use, so that we've attempted to promote a critical engagement with AI, emphasizing the fact that students need to evaluate and they need to be very transparent, and they need to, where appropriate, give a proper citation. And then finally, I think it's important that we make guidelines that are very practical and comprehensive, because there's so many diverse use cases that have to align with learning objectives and academic integrity. So I think the first thing you're going to have to do for any leader who's making this decision now is make a decision on where you're going to stand on the use of AI in the classroom. And I think that it's a no-brainer in some sense, because I think it's something that the workforce is now expecting. I've had former students of mine call me and want to talk to me about how important it is. These are people who have, graduated with a PhD from me many years ago. I'm getting older, and have positions of significant responsibility in large companies. And one of them said to me, "I can't find the people that have the right skill set, because they know how to code and they know how to think and they know how to do computational biology, but they don't know how to use AI. And now everything's changing." And so, there's this we've got to help students become familiar enough with the tools so that they go out in the workflows. They're going to be expected to use these tools. It's a basic skill in some sense. I also would suggest maybe seeking some basic information about what the different generative AI and large language models do, because different ones have different strengths. And also the economic impact of the differences and how they do the computing is something that's perhaps important to be understood, because as you make decisions on what you're going to deploy on your campus, you're making some decisions that are going to continue to reverberate for some time, particularly if you, like we have, made a decision to do a pilot with, for example, Microsoft 365 Copilot. We had a pilot where we've carefully measured the use and tried to understand how it evolved with time, and that process is continuing now. So it's again, I think starting with guidance, not policy, is perhaps the most critical. I'd also suggest trying to have representatives from every school, because that gives people the opportunity to work together across a broad swath of any individual campus. And it also gives you a chance to take advantage of the eagerness of those people who want to work together and want to work fully. And that's the people who saw both the peril and the promise of generative AI. So I thought that gathering of people acted as a magnifying force, so that a lot of people were aware of. It's become a central part of what we discuss on a day-to-day basis. Again, sufficient student participation, sometimes that's hard. And we did it in a more top-down fashion, but I think that we were very lucky that we gathered a group of people together that were very gracious and willing to look at things from different perspectives.
Oh, that's fantastic. Because there's a question in the chat that is really tied tightly to what you just were talking about. I'm going to jump to that, and then we can do the wrap-up question. So I'll read it out loud if you don't have it in front of you. It says, do we, UNC, so this person is obviously at UNC, have any controlled evaluations underway? For example, randomly assigning class sections to use AI or not, and evaluating what policies lead to best educational outcomes.
So I know that there was a proposal to do something along those lines. And I believe that they decided to limit that type of evaluation to one class just to get some experience before they branched out to do a more controlled and complete spectrum. And we also have, well, it's not specifically in a particular classroom, we do have one of our faculty members here in the School of Data Science and Society who's done a pretty thorough survey of trying to understand how different individuals who have responded to her meticulously thought out survey, how it's impacting people at the beginning of the pilot and toward the end of the pilot. So we have we are getting some data, but we don't have enough yet.
Right.
And I think
it's very early on, right? Yeah.
It is, and I would love to see ADSA be, a group that helps us pull together a lot of these insights, because right now we've got a lot of anecdotes, and I think it would be much more helpful to have some hard facts.
Yeah, and centralizing all of these guidelines, eventually maybe
Exactly.
policies. Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll work on that. This series is definitely part of that effort. And for those of you who missed it last time, so last month, we did have someone from the University of Amsterdam, and they also did a very thorough description of their policy and how they're tackling these questions of the usefulness of AI in the classroom. But I do want to wrap up with a little bit of a fun question. So what are you reading, watching, and or listening to learn and keep up with the latest developments in AI?
So we have a homegrown listserv, which is also published as a Substack, and that was launched by an individual faculty member, and he's been gathering resources from a number of faculty members, including myself. And so we try to gather the kind of the collective information into one place, and it's not complete, but it's good. We also have a list that's circulated internally a bit of blogs and podcasts and email newsletters from tech insiders. A lot of what's happening now in Silicon Valley is very helpful to understand because it's going to shape what's going to be happening in the future. Certainly, a shout out to Ethan Mollick for what he's doing at Wharton. He has a very insightful ideas about how LLMs are going to be impacting the academy. We have a lot of urgent work to do as far as much needed foundational research and thought leadership that we need to do. And I'm cognizant of the fact that we're getting very limited in time, but we also need to understand from an industry standpoint what industry is expecting us to do in the classroom. And some sectors in industry are moving faster than others. For example, finance. Certain companies are moving very rapidly, and pharma. I've been surprised at how fast they've moved because I think they did some early pilots and they could see the advantages and enhanced productivity. We also have experts that are embedded in some of the business units and some specialized group that create solutions for specific business problems. So we're, how do we incent people to take the time to be able to use these new tools? It's a challenge, and we talk about it here almost on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis. We need to move faster, but we're limited.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And on top of that's the challenge that every field is different, right? They all need to eventually embrace AI in some form. The future workforce, as you said, industry is expecting these kinds of skill sets, but yeah, I think what that looks like in biology versus sociology, right, can be very different. And so
exactly,
it's not an easy problem, and it's a very urgent one. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing and the folks at UNC-Chapel Hill and this task force. It sounds like you're making some great strides in at least getting some of those guidelines out there. I will note to the audience that might be watching this as a recording, we have a lot of useful links that are dropping in the chat right now, including to research papers and projects, and many of the links to the task force and other resources that were mentioned here. We will put those on the YouTube channel description section. So Stan, thank you again so much for joining us and for sharing your insights.
Very glad to do this, and please call on me anytime you need anything from us.
Great. Good to see you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good beginning of the semester. Take care, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.